there's going to be tremendous destabilization in the corporate community, in the regulated community, and it'll have impacts on the economy. So in this moment, it's really hard to imagine a more direct correlation between what's happening at the Supreme Court level in the law and how it's going to potentially affect corporations moving forward. The first thing a business must do is to decide whether it's important to bring in a lawyer to problem solve. So legal issues that could produce litigation, which could produce some kind of injunction or some kind of money damages outcome that could actually affect the business, that's a much different consideration than bringing in a lawyer to problem solve. Both environments are productive, but as I talk about in my book, How to Think Like a Lawyer, there are moments where you need a lawyer to come in and stop the bleeding or stop the train from going over a cliff, so to speak, whether it's a criminal liability or civil liability. And then there's just that thinking like a lawyer, that problem solving approach that looks for questions and not just outcomes, can be extremely productive and helpful in a business setting, even if there's not a thorny legal question that needs to be resolved in the moment. In the United States, the political unrest produces reactive decision-making by politicians, and it produces, frankly, litigation that can change the legal landscape for businesses. And I'll give two examples. One huge issue, of course, is how the United States Supreme Court has reversed abortion rights in the Dobbs decision. That has created a patchwork of regimes across the country where in certain states there are ways that corporations can foster reproductive options for their employees, and other states where it's frankly illegal, and a company could actually be held liable under the state law for facilitating gender tolerance and reproductive rights for their employees. So that creates some disturbance and uncertainty for corporations. On another note, the United States Supreme Court is in the process, frankly, of dismantling federal agencies' ability to regulate, to make laws separate from the United States Congress. And that's sort of a complex area of law that I can break down. But if the court continues on this path, which I believe it will, we will see a lot of destabilization in the regulatory environment, whether that's food and drug regulation, environmental regulation, nuclear storage of nuclear fuel, aviation, across the spectrum of regulation. If the Supreme Court decides as a matter of the Constitution that agencies can't regulate, there's going to be tremendous destabilization in the corporate community, in the regulated community, and it'll have impacts on the economy. So in this moment, it's really hard to imagine a more direct correlation between what's happening at the Supreme Court level in the law and how it's going to potentially affect corporations moving forward. Businesses can improve decision-making in the workplace by taking into account how we problem solve, and by thinking about problems as questions and not based on outcomes. Much of sort of mainstream decision-making methodology identifies goals and then steps to reaching that goal. Thinking like a lawyer actually flips that dynamic and says, we're going to identify a problem and then look at all of the gray areas, all the questions that are embedded in that problem. Once we identify all the questions embedded in that problem, we can prioritize those questions and then noodle through or think through an outcome that both takes into account all the nuances and has buy-in for the various constituencies or the stakeholders that might have had problems with sort of just a linear approach to a particular outcome. So businesses can take into account legal thinking, the legal analytical method in approaching complex problems in the workplace that starts from the question of what are the problems rather than what are the outcomes. And I think that kind of thinking is more thorough, it's more tailored to the values of the organization, and it's a way to get various stakeholders invested into understanding that there's compromise that needs to be on the table before we get to an actual solution. I would like people to feel inspired and energized around how to become smarter thinkers in an environment, both personally and professionally and politically, that can feel overwhelming and scary. And I do that in a number of ways. Number one is laying out in very simple, common sense terms how to think about really complex legal problems. What's actually happening with the Constitution? What's actually happening in the Supreme Court or with the various Donald Trump trials that are happening in the United States? How can we understand those in very common sense terms? That's number one. Number two is I outline an approach to thinking around problems that starts with questions and not just outcomes and answers, which can be very polarizing and alienating. People get dug into their team, dug into their side, and feel defensive about backing up an outcome rather than really thinking through the nuances of the problems, which can create, I think, more connection with other people. So that's the second thing that I try to do with my speeches. And the third is to sort of leave people on a an inspirational note around common value systems, common humanity, which I really think at the end of the day, there's much more of than we're recognizing in this point, in this moment in history. If we can see how we actually share values with each other, that becomes the focal point of how we problem solve through these thorny issues, I think we can have more buy-in and more community. And that's really a note that I hope to leave audiences with, so they're not so much defeated, but they're enlivened and they're motivated to even in a small scale, large scale, to affect change so they can feel empowered.